Hi guys, and welcome to episode 5 of ABC. Today I am back down at Stanwick Lakes, but this time I am on Roman Lake, the syndicate lake that I am very lucky to be a member of. Temperatures right now are over 30 degrees. There's lots of fish cruising around on the surface. It's absolutely prime floater fishing conditions, and that's the subject I'd like to cover in this episode. For me, the beauty of fishing for carp on the surface, especially on a really hot day like today, is you can generally see the fish that you're fishing for, and location shouldn't be too difficult. Now, for example, when I got here today, I had to walk around the lake and there was lots of areas that I could rule out where I wasn't seeing fish, and you should be seeing carp on a day where it's 30 degrees, very little wind, you should be finding carp. So there's lots of areas I could rule out. Then I came to this narrow arm of the lake that's connected to the main body. The wind is gently pushing down here, and when I came here, it didn't take me long before I could spot carp. There's quite a few fish milling around, probably about 20-25 yards from the bank, including some real chunks too. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to get some bait in the swim, and hopefully we can get them feeding. Now, when it comes to feed for surface fishing, there are a multitude of options available, from sugar puffs and marshmallows to cat biscuits and dog biscuits. But for me, the standout bait for fishing on the surface is without a doubt floating trout pellet. Now, I know a lot of people like to use dog biscuits in these situations, and I'm not saying floating dog biscuits won't catch you carp. They have caught so many carp over the years and will continue to do so. But for me, I think once the carp get a taste for those floating trout pellets, which are designed for a fish's diet, once they get a taste for it, they actively seek out more and more. And for me, it's a big edge, especially when the carp are feeding a little bit tentatively and not really wolfing down the floaters. In these situations, trout pellets score above anything else. Now, I always take 2 different sizes of floating trout pellets with me for a session. Here I have a bucket of 11mm floating trout pellets, and in the other bucket here I have some smaller 6mm floaters. And there's several advantages of having 2 different sizes. First of all, I think by having 2 different sizes of floaters out there, I think it makes it harder for the fish to differentiate what the hook bait is. Also, those smaller pellets really can build up a very positive feeding response. Maybe it's because it's more like what their natural food items are, I don't know, but once they start feeding on those smaller items, they seem to become almost preoccupied. Also, because they have to eat a lot more of them before they get full, they will feed in the area for longer. And the longer those carp are feeding in the swim, the better your chances of catching. Well, that first swim that I visited amounted to nothing. There was quite a few fish there, but they didn't seem willing to feed at all. And the fish that were there have now moved out of that arm to an area where it kind of meets the main body of the lake. And as the wind's pushing down here, there's quite a lot of surface scum just gathered. and there's lots of fish milling around in amongst that surface scum and debris. I've been flicking in floaters for probably about half an hour, and they've just started taking now, and there's quite a few fish taking. So I think it's about time I made a cast. There's some big fish there as well. There is some really big fish. Right, I'm going to sneak towards the front of the peg to make this cast. A lot of the fish are fairly close in, to about halfway to the opposite bank. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to cast the float really close to the opposite bank, and then slowly retrieve the float and the rig in amongst these feeding fish. If I was just to cast this in amongst the feeding fish, it'd be game over. And it'd be over before it even started. Right, I'm going to sneak in place now and make this cast. Oh, there's fish taking quite close in. What I'm doing now, I'm sneaking the float in place, but at the same time I'm keeping all the line off the surface as I'm doing it. So I'm not dragging the line sort of through the swim, I'm just gently retrieving that float. And that's it. That's in place. I'm going to sneak back. The beauty of this particular setup is you don't have to keep your eyes focused on the hook bait. It's a self-hooking setup, and when the fish has made a mistake, it's pretty obvious. Well, while I'm waiting for the fish to hopefully start feeding, let me take you through the tackle that I use for pretty much all of my surface fishing. So the rod is a Horizon X3 float rod. As the name suggests, it's a dedicated surface fishing rod. It's a 2¼ pound test curve. It's nice and soft, and that makes it perfect when fishing with small hooks and light diameter, fine breaking strain lines. It basically acts as a big shock absorber to cushion any lunges the fish may have and avoid any breakages on light tackle that is often needed to try and tempt wary surface feeding fish. That is coupled with a 10,000 size reel. Here I'm using the EOS 10,000. It's a nice lightweight reel that balances perfectly with the rod itself. The reel is loaded with 12-pound surface line. Again, as the name suggests, it's a dedicated surface fishing mono. Now, the advantage of this is it floats, and so many other lines on the market don't float. When you are fishing on the surface, it's important to have the line floating. Otherwise, if it should sink, as those fish are moving around in the upper layers, that line could come in contact with the fish's face or the fins, and that will spook the fish. Now, the float I'm using here is a bolt bubble in the extra large size, and this is pretty much the only size I use out of the range, and it has several advantages by using it in such a big size. First of all, it allows me to cast a long way, so even if the fish are feeding on the surface up to 100 yards, I can still reach them with this float. Also, because I can cast such a long way, it allows me to cast generally beyond where the fish are feeding. So if I've managed to get fish feeding at anything up to 100 yards, I can cast this float past the fish and then slowly retrieve it in place, sneaking it right in amongst where those fish are feeding so they don't even know that the rig has been placed there. Also, this large size offers more weight, more resistance, and therefore it really emphasizes the bolt effect, especially when it's coupled with a short hook link, which I'll talk about now. So the hook link here, I'm using the Zig and Floater. In this instance, there isn't much weed in front of me, so I'm using it in the 10-pound breaking strain. And again, it floats, which is very important. Like I said before, if that line should sink, as the fish are approaching the hook bait or feeding on free offerings, that line comes in contact with the fish's face or the fins, it will spook them. If you come down to the sharp end here, I'm using a size 10 Zig and Floater hook. Even though these hooks have an out-turned eye, I like to include a bit of silicone to ensure that line exits straight. That way it doesn't narrow the gape, which will compromise the hooking properties of this setup. The hook bait, I've mounted a hookable soft floating pellet here, and I've set it up, it's knotless knot, almost like a KD style, almost as if it's been bait banded on. That way, when a fish is viewing the hook bait from below, the hook itself is masked by the silhouette of the hook bait. So it's going some way to mimic the free offerings as best as I can. So I mentioned before that I had another rod in play, but it wasn't actually fishing. So I'm just going to explain a bit more about what was going on there. Now, I think one of the biggest hurdles to overcome when surface fishing is bird life, be it ducks, geese, swans, flamingos or seagulls. And on this particular lake, they are a nightmare. I've never known a lake with so many seagulls. So what I have here is my spod rod with bright coloured braid, bright orange braid in this instance. And what I did, I put on a impact spod and I cast it over to the trees on the far margin, actually in the trees. I wasn't drilling it in hard, it's an empty spod and it was just sort of falling gently onto the upper branches. Then I was just laying the rod so all the line was above the surface of the water, and with that bright coloured braid going up into the tree, the gulls don't like it one bit. They can't dive, they can't swoop down. It really, I don't know if it distracts them or disturbs them, I don't know, but they just leave me alone when that's in place. Now, obviously you can't go around on lakes just chucking spods on the far bank on every lake. But in this instance, I'm fishing a quiet syndicate lake. In fact, I'm the only person here. So you can't go doing this on busy day ticket or club lake. So what do you do if you are on a quiet lake but you don't have a far margin to cast to? Well, in that instance, I would swap the spod for a heavy lead and cast it out as not to interfere with anyone else's fishing, and just keep the rod high in the air so as much braid as possible was running above the water. Now you see here I've just brought the rod in to demonstrate what I'm going to do, and the gulls are bothering me for the first time today. Until now they've just been taking the floaters that have been drifting out of the swim, so they've actually been doing me a favour in that instance, but this is the first time they've actually sort of dived down in the area I'm fishing. So let's get them on their way and get this spod back in that tree on the other side. You see there, as soon as I've done that, the gulls have gone. Completely gone. They hate it. So you see there, I just cast it to the top of that tree over there. The spod was just sort of hanging over one of the little flimsy branches on the end. And it was just a flick. I managed to get the spod back at all. Obviously it was a fully loaded spod and I drilled it in right into the thick of the tree and I wouldn't get it back. But in this instance it was just sort of hanging over one of the little branches, little flick, and it comes off. But don't go doing it when there's people fishing on the other side. Now when it comes to introducing my floater freebies, there are two pieces of apparatus that I use. And the first one is a throwing stick. Now you might be asking, why would I use a throwing stick and not a catapult? Well, it has several advantages. I can get free baits out further with a throwing stick than I can with a catapult. I can also bait up single-handed. I can put the throwing stick, the end of the throwing stick, in a bucket of floaters, and even while I'm playing a fish, if the fish are still feeding out there, I can bait up one-handed, keep those fish interested, and hopefully when the fish goes in the net, I can cast back out and get another one. But also, I think the main reason I use a throwing stick is I found myself carrying out repairs on the catapult at really vital times. When the fish were feeding like mad, the elastic would break or the pouch would break. And you think about how much that catapult is in use during a typical floater session. It's in constant use, baiting up, and inevitably breakages are going to happen and you are going to have to carry out repairs. Whereas with a throwing stick, it won't break unless you stand on it, which I have done several times. So we actually arrived at the fishery yesterday late afternoon, and it was really hard work getting those fish feeding. Couldn't gain any sort of momentum at all. They'd have a little flurry of activity where they'd take a few floaters and then stop, and it just didn't seem quite right. I've come back down the lake early this morning and the fish are spawning. So that does explain why they weren't really feeding properly yesterday. And now that they're spawning, I'm obviously going to leave them to it. But the beauty of Stanwick Lakes is there are a number of lakes on this complex, so we have options available. So right now I'm going to head over to Swan Lake. It's a very prolific lake on the complex, and hopefully we can get a bit of surface action. So now I'm over on Swan Lake, and I guess this is a more typical fishing situation, if you like. This is a busy day ticket lake, but as is often the case, the corner swims are the last to go. And I've come here to a neglected corner of the lake, and it's one of the last swims remaining, but there's a lot of carp down here. I've already fired out a few floating trout pellets and they seem quite cooperative. So were the gulls, and that's going to be a bit of a challenge because it is a busy lake. I'm not able to cast on the far bank, not unless I hit that guy in the face with it. So I'm not able to cast on the far bank to get the line over, across, and scare the gulls away. So yes, it's going to be a bit of a challenge, but yeah, I'm convinced we can get one on the bank.